All right, guys, I'm waiting for this. I've been given very specific instructions. Okay, I think we're good. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar today. Of course, we're back. 2 weeks ago, we were talking on issues in Venezuela. Now we're back with more geopolitical coverage, obviously talking about the situation in Iran. We're going to look to break down everything surrounding the current situation from the geopolitical side to how it flows through to commodity markets. Of course, my name is Reid Ianson. I'm an economist here at Kepler. I'm joined by my colleagues, Amina, who is our head of OPEC Plus analysis and Middle Eastern analysis, Hamayoun, who is our head of crude analysis here at Kepler, and Michelle, who is handling everything geopolitical analysis. Before we jump into this, it's mostly going to be a discussion session today. We'll have 25 to 30 minutes of a panel discussion with these folks and then a 10-minute Q&A at the end. Again, as we go through this presentation, please feel free to ask your questions and we will look to come to them at the end. With that being said, Hamayoun, I think we should open it up with you and just set the stage around the current oil market supply-demand balance. Maybe you can just lay the groundwork for the fundamentals of the broader oil market and how Iran plays into that supply and demand balance.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Reid. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be with you today. So, yeah, I mean, look, we're in a oversupplied market. I think it's a surprise to no one. Over the past few months and actually the past 2, 3 years, we've seen prices, having a bearish trend. And this year, actually, we think that oversupply is going to be even larger than last year. So throughout the year, we see a 1.6 million barrels per day oversupply. That should be actually peaking right now as we speak. So in the first quarter, that oversupply gets close to 3 million barrels per day. So that 1.6 million barrels per day oversupply is pretty much what Iran exports in terms of the market share. So that'd be a bit less than 2% of global supply, but around 3% of total seaborne oil trade. The thing is, Iran mainly exports to China. I mean, we'll get to that story later on in the webinar. But so China is going to be mainly impacted if there is a supply disruption there. But it's exactly, the oversupply, it's exactly what Iran exports right now. So if we lose, let's say, all of Iran's exports, then we get into a situation where the market is not oversupplied anymore. And obviously that will have huge implications in terms of pricing.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And as you mentioned, Hamayoun, we'll come back to some more specifics around the supply and demand. But I think first, maybe we talk more about the geopolitical situation. So Michelle, I'll come to you. I think the current situation with Iran brings back memories of the red line that the Obama administration set in Syria more than a decade ago. Obviously, that red line was not upheld. More broadly, how do you think that markets distinguish between deliberate U.S. restraint and a loss of deterrence?
So it's really interesting. I was listening to In Bremer's 2026 forecast of like geopolitical risk, and he sets out this framework, which I think is a really helpful framework when looking at what Trump is doing. And he has the FAFO framework, which is, I'm sorry, I know this is a family show, F around and find out. And then there's the taco framework, which is Trump always chickens out. And there's these two frameworks, there's these two pieces that are like bookends of the framework. And where does Iran fit inside of those frameworks? So I think if we can look at each country based on FAFO and taco, it is helpful for us to like put some parameters around what Iran looks like and what the red line for Trump looks like. So when I was looking at it from that perspective, I started to think Iran is like right in the middle, right? Like it is weak, so it meets the FAFO parameters, which is it's weak militarily, it's weak economically, its citizens are rising up, so it has this like weakness to it, but it has like a strong taco part to it, which is it could disrupt the Strait of Hormuz. So I think when we have these two pieces of it, it makes it difficult to know where it sits. And I think even Trump doesn't know what to do. So as he moves military pieces like ships into the Middle East, he's starting to allow himself to be like a part of the FAFA, where he's going to go in, which is like a Venezuela type action. But he also gives himself the ability to chicken out if he wants to, where he can say that the administration is meeting some of the demands that he requested, which is don't kill 800 people in the street, even though probably 20,000 people or so have been killed there. So we're starting to see hit restraint. His restraint is they've met my demands of not killing 800 people. And it gives him the option to taco out. But we also hear the people uprising, which gives him the option to FAFO if he needs to.
Got it. And I think to build on that question, obviously, 2 weeks ago, maybe the U.S. did not have the type of forward force deployment that was required to go ahead with some kind of Iranian strike. Of course, now we've seen the United States move forward and bring the Abraham Lincoln CSG into theater. Um, you know, I'm going to ask you really directly, what are the chances you think that the United States does follow through with some kind of kinetic engagement in Iran? And, of course, what are some alternatives for the administration if they don't want to go that route, but they still want to influence Iranian policy?
I think the odds of them going into Iran are very low. I would say 5%. I mean, maybe lower than 5%. I think there's a number of reasons why they wouldn't do it. Iran is already hindered from what happened in June. So, and what is happening to Iran is an internal problem, right? Like it is protesters, it's people rising up. It's not an external problem. So it's not Israel has a problem with Iran. It is everything that's happening inside. And it's almost like you want to give the people you want to cheerlead them to overthrow the regime if that's what the people want. And you want them to have like an organic movement of overthrowing the regime if the people can do that in Iran. And I think that Israel's request for the US to restrain themselves is because Israel isn't prepared if Iran attacks back. And I don't think Trump wants any sort of attack happening in the Strait, which I also find a very, very tiny odds of something happening in the Strait. I think all eyes are on the Strait when there are much bigger risks of hitting oil production. Like, what if the people protecting the oil fields decide to join the protesters, right? I mean, Javier Blas wrote about it last week. What if they join and shut down oil fields in Iran? What happens if they light the fields on fire, right? So I think there are bigger risks to oil production in the region than shutting the Strait of Hormuz. And all of Trump's problems are solved with low oil prices, or a significant amount of them are solved with low oil prices, or he certainly thinks so. So he doesn't want to do anything that's going to risk raising oil prices. And if you go in, it is going to be Trump has already said no boots on the ground. So he doesn't want anything that is going to require boots on the ground. And there have been article after article of generals saying if you want regime change, you have to have international support. You have to have more than just the US and Israel going in, and you're going to have boots on the ground. There has to be some strategy going into it. So I think the odds of them forcing a regime change is very low. And the regional actors, the Saudis, the Emiratis, they don't want a destabilized Iran. And just to go back really quickly with Obama's red line, when he didn't enforce his red line, it was his greatest foreign policy mistake. And you had refugee crisis, there was a significant amount that happened, and that was 30 million people. Iran has like 100 million people in it. And a refugee crisis out of Iran could be disastrous, not just for the region itself, but also it'll destabilize the world. So I think that him doing any military action would require a significant amount of international support, which I don't think he has.
Yeah, that's fair. And of course, I have to kind of speak in as the economist of the group here. The US is living in a world right now where, pretty aggressive tariffs are in place. And
Mm.
we're kind of living in a world where inflation in the US is sitting at about 3%, 2.5 to 3%. That's well above the Fed's target. And that's despite an environment where oil prices have really been in the decline for quite a while now. And so if you got a big spike in energy prices, that's a problem on the domestic front for Trump. Absolutely. Michelle, maybe just to kind of pivot to how do the Israelis think about the current situation? Obviously, there were some reports that Netanyahu was maybe pushing the Trump administration to take a pause on any kind of strike package. So maybe you can just speak a bit more about that.
You know, it is my sense that Israel's not prepared for an Iran strike back. So if something does happen in Iran, I don't think Israel has rebuilt at its defense mechanisms after what had happened in June of last year. So I think Iran wants to, or Israel wants to wait for that reason. I think also Israel wants to wait to see if the protesters can actually overthrow the regime. Like, why get involved when you can and be a part of that when you can give the credit to the protesters? And it is my sense that Israel wants restraint and doesn't want to get involved because it's not Iran picking on Israel. It is an internal problem, and I think everyone wants to just wait and see how the internal problem is going to resolve itself. That's the sense that I get.
Fair enough. Alana, we're going to come to you next and speak a little bit more about how OPEC Plus sees the current situation. Maybe if you could just give us a broad-based view on what OPEC Plus is thinking about with the current situation in Iran.
Sure. I mean, this year, Reed, I think it's very clear that the OPEC Plus group needs to deal with a lot of geopolitical risk. It started off very strong with Trump intervening in Venezuela, and then now we're talking about the issues in Iran. Of course, all of these uncertainties are spilling into the fact that, I mean, we are seeing prices get supported by the geopolitical risk, not to the same extent that we would have seen them rise maybe a decade ago. I would say the prices more or less are kind of resilient to this geopolitical risk because of the big oversupply or the overhang that we have, especially during the first quarter of the year. So a lot of focus is on that oversupply. And till this point, we haven't seen any outage in supply that would lead to a really big panic that we would see, prices spike up. But nonetheless, I mean, the prices are supported by the geopolitical risks that we're seeing either in Venezuela, the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and of course, the situation in the Middle East because of Iran. Now, with OPEC, it's really, really important for the group to continue this policy of removing anything related to geopolitics out of the group decision making, because you have members of this group that are being impacted by all these policies and impacted by Trump that might go in and just ruin the entire agreement. And this is not something that the group wants to see. This is not something definitely Saudi Arabia wants to see. So they're kind of sticking to the fact that, they haven't let politics ruin policy, and they want to maintain that for the time being. And what I'm seeing during, meetings so far, there haven't been discussions around Iran. There haven't been discussions around Venezuela. The group still has some spare capacity that if we do see an outage somewhere, and there is oversupply in the system, that would be able to meet the demand that we're expecting to grow this year. I think our forecasts are around 1.3 million for the year of growth. So we don't have to worry about not finding the supply. But navigating around all of this is really tricky. And for a country like Iran, they've made it clear that, for example, when we're talking about baseline assessments, they don't want a US company, which is going to be working with the other members, to evaluate their capacity. They're going to go with another system where production of 3 months of their production in the summer, it's going to be averaged out, and the baseline is going to be based on that. Of course, that depends what happens if we are going to see an intervention with Trump that might impact supply. So all of these issues might play out into what would happen with this capacity assessment that we're expecting to be concluded by the end of this year.
Yeah, that's fair. And does OPEC Plus have some kind of contingency in place if you were to see a loss of Iranian volumes?
Well, I wouldn't say that the plan is on hand and they've like pre-agreed everything, but we have seen in the past when we had outages from Libya, for example, we saw Saudi Arabia raise production. So if you see an outage somewhere in Iran, yes, I would expect other members to increase their supply. And anyway, we are expecting that they're going to be continuing unwinding their cuts. So that those extra barrels are going to be hitting the market as soon as they evaluate the situation post the first quarter. So I wouldn't be too worried about, supply being lost. But any shock to the system, Reed, I mean, if you come and say, okay, we have a huge outage, of course, that's enough to make the price spike for some time. And until people realize or the market realizes that there is ample supply in the market. I just want to make a comment with regards to something that you've mentioned before around prices and Trump wanting lower oil prices. But it's also really important to have a price point for this region to maintain a level of stability and geopolitical stability. At $40 oil, you don't have a stable region. And this is important for, not just for the US. And if the US is Israel's biggest ally, having oil prices in a certain range that would support the budgets of countries surrounding Israel, that's also a matter of kind of security and national security that I think factors into the equation.
Do you have a kind of a middle ground price you think works pretty well?
I think the current range is it works well for Trump, works well for, I'm seeing countries in the region adapt to it. So if we're talking, I don't know, 60 to 65, that seems to be the band that is acceptable for now.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think this question kind of builds and you've maybe answered this a bit. But like, do you think that Saudi and the UAE are benefiting from kind of the risk premium that's being injected into the market right now? Or do you think that's being offset by the risks of some kind of kinetic engagement and that could create more regional destabilization?
Well, of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries in the region don't want to see a void in Iran. Iran is a huge country. If you have an Iran that doesn't have strong leadership in place and that spills over into the region, this is not something that they want to see. Each of these countries has their own economic plans, the economic diversification. They want investment into the country. So all of that was going to ruin any short-term or medium-term plans that they have in place. And I think this is part of the reason where you've been hearing and we've been seeing a lot of reports around Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other Gulf states maybe lobbying Trump or the US to not intervene. And they understand that an intervention might not necessarily remove the Iranian regime. So it would be kind of useless to have another intervention that doesn't really uproot the problem. And if it does, it leaves a void which would spill over into the region. So that's the kind of fear here. I would tell you, if you're looking at budgets purely, yes, of course, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE would prefer a higher price to support budgets, to support spending, but you need the price to be sustained at that level. Just a short-term spike is not worth the turmoil that we would see if we have a void in Iran.
Got it. That makes sense. Hamayoun, I'm going to come to you next. We've had a lot of discussions around, what's the geopolitical situation? How is OPEC Plus looking at this? Again, I think we now need to kind of level set with some numbers. First, if America were to commit to some kind of kinetic engagement in Iran, how much Iranian oil supply do you think would be at risk? And how might that change your current outlook for supply and demand this year?
Yeah, sure. I think it's obviously possible to give, a precise number. One good way to look at it is to look at what happened back in June and when Israel attacked Iran, and we didn't see any impact. Actually, in the first few days of the attack, we even saw more loadings from Iranian ports. and also from the other countries as countries rushed in pushing barrels as far away as possible from the Persian Gulf. I think it doesn't mean that even an attack from the US doesn't mean that we'll have any disruption in supply. However, we could see a disruption if there's widening strikes hitting the oil sector in Iran. It hasn't happened so far. It hasn't happened back in June. It didn't happen in the previous rounds of protests in the previous years as well. It doesn't mean it will not happen in the next few months. If I think parts of the regime, parts of the system believe that everything is collapsing, then we could see it. The revolution back in 79 took about 13 months to actually succeed. So I think this is the key risk in terms of disruption. Otherwise, I think even if we see an attack, it's more likely that we actually see the oil flowing, and even if Iran has means to disturb the flows in the region, it would be at their own expense as well. So that's also, I think, a very low likelihood.
Got it. And I think you have to kind of move this question forward. And of course, Michelle spoke about this a moment ago. We don't think the Strait of Hormuz will be closed. However, again, we're considering scenarios. If Iran, did move to close the strait, what would be the impact on global oil supply in that scenario? And then could the United States easily reopen it? Maybe just your thoughts on kind of the fundamentals around the strait.
Yeah, sure. So, it's obviously a key passage area for global oil. It's about 40% of global seaborne oil trade that passes through it. It's about 15 million barrels per day. I'm talking about crude and condensate. Obviously, there's also products and LNG involved. I think for LNG, it's about 20% of global LNG. So obviously very significant. There are ways to bypass the strait, but they are limited. So that 15 million barrels per day, we think only about, the volumes that currently pass through it, about 9 million barrels per day of that 15 would not be able to find another, solution to exit the strait. And the other ways that you can bypass is via the Saudis East-West pipeline, which has a 7 million barrels per day capacity. It's currently being used to feed the refineries on the west coast of the kingdom, and also some exports via the Red Sea. And you also have the Atqab pipeline linking the onshore fields in Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah, which is also being used currently, and where we think spare capacity is in the pipeline currently is around 500 kbd. And from Saudi, it would be around 5 million barrels per day. But in total, if you look at the 15 million barrels per day, the calculation that we've made is that on a sustainable basis, you could lose 9 million barrels per day. Iran itself actually has a pipeline which has a 300 kbd capacity, linking the fields in the southwest of the country to the port of Jask on the Gulf of Oman. So Iran itself could bypass the strait, but that would mean that its exports would divide by 5 or 6. If it were to happen, though, I think even though we've always said that the probability is close to 0%, because that would hit Iran's main customer, which is China, which gets 50% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. But at the same time, I think if you believe that if the regime believes that it is actually on the verge of collapse, nothing is impossible, I would say. If it really thinks that it reaches a point where it has nothing to lose, then it could be possible, even though I think obviously the probability is still very low. But even if it still were to happen, I think with the multiple aircraft carriers from the US getting into the region, you mentioned the Abraham Lincoln. I think the George Bush one also is on the move. I think it would just take about 24 to 48 hours maximum for the strait to be reopened. Obviously, like the Iran's Navy the US Navy is unmatched, especially when it comes to Iran's Navy. It's not its strongest point when it comes to the military. So it wouldn't last long.
Thanks for that, Hamayoun. And one more for you, just around, you mentioned it earlier in this webinar that China's buying almost all Iranian crude. Um, if you were to have a loss of Iranian barrels, how would that impact the Chinese market? And, what kind of discounts are they receiving on that crude at the moment?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part of the question. The discount is currently around $10 per barrel on average against Brent. So obviously very significant because you look at the competition, even the Russian competition is a few barrels more expensive. It's now getting closer to the Iranian one, but previously used to be even trading above Brent. And the competition from the Middle East, or West Africa or Brazil, it's like $3-4 per barrel above Brent. So Iranian crude right now is around between $12 and $15 per barrel cheaper than the competition. So obviously very key for these teapots, especially that are by far the main buyers of Iranian oil. I think what would happen is, and again, the what happened in June with the war provides a good indication of what in the first days the market reaction is going to be. We saw a huge widening of the spread between Brent and Dubai. We saw a steepening of the backwardation in Dubai, but Brent strengthening even further. What this means is you'll see a rush into other grades from the region, even from non-buyers of Iranian crude. They would be looking to secure more and more supply in the short term, and so that would mean that the pricing of medium sour grades, because Iran mainly produces medium sour oil from the Middle East, especially, is going to rise significantly in the front month. But other competition as well from, for example, Brazil and West Africa is also going to significantly rise, even though I would say that the Asian refiners would mainly be looking at Middle Eastern supplies instead because of that widening Brent-Dubai spread that we're likely going to see.
Got it. Thanks for that, Hamayoun. Michelle, we'll finish with you. Again, keep the conversation going around price expectations. Obviously, the geopolitical uncertainty from Venezuela and Iran have injected a risk premium into the oil markets. Um, you know, mid-month, mid-January, Brent was peaking out at 2-month highs. What's your view for the current spot price environment, and what do you think about the futures curve as well?
Well, I think that there's a lot of oil. I think there's a lot of oil around Venezuela is an unlikely suspect to increase production. But it just went from a sanctioned barrel to an unsanctioned barrel, so that adds a little bit more to the mix. It's also coming to the US, which means it can back out other barrels that can go elsewhere. So I tend to be pretty bearish. I think the average for 2026 should be Brent around $50, maybe 55 if China somehow increases more production, increases more imports. I'm not super bullish the price. I think that it may be a violent rocky move down, right? Like it goes violently nowhere for a while and then it takes a leg down and then it goes violently nowhere, then it takes another leg down. So I tend to think that on average, if as long as we don't have like a big disruption in Iran or a big disruption in some other part of the world, then I don't see why oil with the oversupply expectations from everybody, not just like the Kepler S&D, but like if you look at all of the banks S&Ds also have very large oversupplies for the year. I know we had a large oversupply for 2025, and most of that oversupply was absorbed by China, which inherently looked like demand. So I think that we're going to have pretty low prices through 2026 at least.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that, Michelle. We're going to shift over and take some questions from the audience now. Amina, we'll start with you. It looks like someone's asking, what was the comment on the baseline using the summer 3-month average? Is that the recommendation from the US or is that OPEC Plus member suggestions?
No, the US doesn't make any recommendations when it comes to OPEC plus. So that's basically the average of Iranian production that's going to be used to determine their baseline for them. So their production for the months of August, September, and October this year is going to be used, and the average of those 3 months is going to be their new baseline in 2027. And since that, I mean, the company that OPEC Plus contracted happens to be a US company, not all members are comfortable, including Russia, by the way, who's working with the US company opening up their databases and so on. And so this is an alternative way for countries that can't deal with a US based auditor to have their new baseline. With Russia and I believe it was Venezuela, they're going to be dealing with a different company that is not based out of the US. We still don't know the company's name, but yeah, for Iran, that was a choice that it was given by the OPEC Plus members, and it accepted this as a kind of compromise to determine its new baseline.
Awesome. That makes sense. Michelle, I'm going to come to you next. A number of questions just about, the shift in force posture from the United States over the past week. If the U.S. doesn't want to put boots on the ground, maybe just reiterate your views about why Trump is pushing so much hardware into the region.
Well, that hardware also was in the region in June, and we didn't have boots on the ground. So, and it has existed many times in history, and we didn't have boots on the ground in Iran. I think that Trump has made it really clear, whether it was in his State of the Union address at the beginning of last year, or whether it was in his entire um, presidential campaign, that he doesn't like boots on the ground. He doesn't like forever wars, and he likes the one and done kind of thing. And for a regime change, I don't think that you can have like a one and done kind of thing. You need consistency. You need, now, maybe he wants to chop the head off of the regime like he did in Venezuela and leave the body of the snake, right? So maybe he just wants Khamenei out, and the rest of the regime will do his bidding. I also think it's interesting because Trump is so transactional, and Trump is also very creative in getting the things that he wants, that it's possible that maybe he can do something with the regime, with a regime that's not Khamenei, or with maybe the IRGC or whoever could be the new leader. I don't the problem with a regime change in Iran is there's no natural opposition leader rising up. And I think that in order for that to happen, you really do need a natural opposition leader if you want to help them along. And that really no one has like really risen up yet. So boots on the ground, I think is a no-go for Trump. I don't think I can't think of a scenario where it would be okay. Cutting the head off the regime like he did in Venezuela, maybe is something that he would be interested in doing. He could try to get Iranian oil to the market, so he could try to do something where he does a deal. I mean, I think we've seen him FOFO out so many times, or taco out so many times, that he'll give everybody whatever they want in order to feel like he made some sort of like concession. So I think it's possible that we could see something that's going to look creative with the current regime or with a new regime, or they may just sit back and like make sure that we're moving ships into the region to make sure the Strait isn't closed. But other than that, we're just going to monitor and see what happens. But I think boots on the ground is a no-go.
Fair enough. Hamayoun, going to come to you next. It's a fundamental question around, okay, you kind of talked about LNG and crude through the Strait. Do you have any idea what volumes of products and LPG are flowing through there?
No, actually, I don't. I'm crude. I'm focusing on crude, so I have no idea. But I can actually check and tell the number after in
Yeah, and
about
we
2 minutes.
thankfully do
So
track this data in real time. Of course, I'm cheating by asking Hamoun, who is our crude analyst, a product question. But of course, all of this information is readily available in real time within the Kepler platform. We'll go
I
ahead and
would
shift.
um,
Yeah,
I would just read, if you allow me, just 1 minute. I would just on the
sure.
back of what Michel said.
Mhm.
I actually have a different view, and we see what happens. But I think that if you look at Trump, it's his second mandate, and he knows that this is the last, should be the last mandate normally, and I think that he is going to be willing to put his name into history, or at least looking at his ego, this is what he's looking for. And my analysis is that after all what happened last year, and the fact that he keeps saying that he stopped all these wars, I think the next big change for him and his legacy is going to be changing the Middle East. And you cannot just change the Middle East with a new deal with the Iranian regime, or even just chopping off the head of Khamenei. So my thinking is that there is some sort of a plan between him and Netanyahu, and likewise Netanyahu is also concerned about his legacy. And so I think, these guys want in 30, 40 years everyone to remember that 2026 or 2028, things happened in the Middle East, and it was because of these two guys, and that's why the face of the Middle East changed. So my view is that there is some sort of a plan. It may not take, it may not be short term. It may take months or even years, but I'm thinking that by 2028, something is going to happen. And I would just add that, I don't think it's an internal issue anymore, because it's a regime that kills more than 20,000 people. I mean, it's not just a number, it's actually people that have been killed. And what I would say is that a lot of people in Iran are it's different to the other places, and I think that they are really calling for an intervention. And I think that if you look at Trump, also he hates being compared to Obama, and that's why I think the red line, Trump probably is aware that right now he would be compared to Obama if he doesn't do anything. So my thinking is something's going to happen. It may not be short term, but in the longer run, something's going to happen.
Fair enough. And obviously, we're trying to balance these geopolitical risks with the current oversupply dynamics. Uh, Maybe you could just give our official price forecast from the Kepler research team.
Yeah, sure. So we're actually, I would say, on the higher end compared to what you could see out there. And it's been the case even before what happened in Venezuela and Iran. So most likely we're going to be putting that number even slightly higher because of the higher geopolitical risks. But so far, what we have is for Brent, we have an average of close to $65 per barrel for the year for 2026. It's really moving into a narrow range of between 60 and 70. We don't think that prices would go crazy unless there's a huge disruption around the Middle East, which would be the only, I would say, factor that could spark a huge move upwards. But otherwise, the oversupply is such that, as Michel correctly said, the oversupply is such that actually the market should be in a bearish mood, and it's really geopolitical risks that prevent that from happening. And I would also add, last point to that is that it could also, I would say, shape the US positioning and policies in the future, because they know that in that oversupply market, even if they take extreme measures such as the one we saw in Venezuela and potentially another one in Iran, you would not see prices go totally crazy, above $100, and you would most likely see a spike and then prices come down. So I think that actually is I would say a positive catalyst for them to take action.
Makes sense. Just a couple of other questions here. It looks like, do you believe, and Hamayun and maybe Michelle, I'll go to both of you on this one. Do you believe that the U.S. could repeat the tanker seizures that we have seen with the whole Venezuela situation? So maybe Hamayun and then Michelle, you guys can answer this one.
I don't think so, because even though Iran's military is nothing compared to the U.S., it still is a lot more powerful than Venezuela. And I think the risk associated with that would be too large, and also even on the public opinion side, I wouldn't see how the U.S. could gain from doing that. So I think this is pretty unlikely, and I agree with Michel that I think most of the military buildup in the short term is really to secure the safe passage of ships rather than to seize ships.
I guess I also find it unlikely. I think that Trump, although I totally agree, Trump he wants his legacy. I mean, he wants to be on Mount Rushmore. So like the guy is definitely concerned about his legacy. I think he cares about his legacy most in the Western Hemisphere. So like he'll seize this ship in what he considers like his domain, which is the US, Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, like that region. I think he's concerned about ships there. And I think that the thing that he wants the most is Greenland. So I think that although he cares about the Middle East, he cares more about the Saudis than he cares about than he cares about anything. The Saudis, the Qataris, where he's doing business. Whereas, like, of course, the American people care most about Israel. But I think that this is just, I would be really curious if Amina also thinks this. The Saudis, the UAE, Kuwait, they are much better off with a weak Iran than a weak Iran where it currently lives, because at least that Iran puts Israel in check than Iran that has a regime change, which is going to be more friendly to Israel, because then Israel would be the hegemon in that entire region. So I think it seems regionally that Iran that's weak and has, like, throws a few punches here and there like it's been doing, is better off for that region than to have an entire regime change. Even though an entire regime change, of course, would be better for the people of Iran. Um, so I don't think, I think that Trump is just there to make sure nothing happens in the Strait. I don't think he's interested in seizing ships, or I mean, I could be wrong. Like I said, I think he's stuck between Taco and Fafo, and like he could, anything could happen. Maybe he would seize a ship. I think that it would be, I don't think he's interested in like stirring up high oil prices, and seizing a ship in the Strait is very different than seizing a ship in the Gulf of Mexico, where you can still have, like, you're not going to really impact traffic. But if you seize a ship there and the regime sees it as like a threat to their, I don't know, to the regime as it is, then maybe something could happen in the Strait. And I just don't think that Trump, again, like, he wants low oil prices, and I don't think he wants to do anything that's going to risk that.
Michelle, just to follow up on that, I think there's a kind of sigh of relief here in the region that he's so obsessed with Greenland. So
Mhm.
all the attention, I mean, even the Davos speech now that I'm seeing, some of the headlines come out, it's all around Greenland. So yeah, you're absolutely right about, I mean, the region here doesn't want to see a spillover of a void. There isn't a natural leader, and I sympathize with what Hamayoun said as well for the Iranian people and what the number of protesters that were killed and so on. The Iranian people deserve a lot better than they've been, exposed to for decades now. However, regionally here, there's a different calculation, and yeah, they don't want to see any of this instability impact their economies. And Iran is just too close in
Mhm.
proximity.
Thanks for that. All right, guys, we're going to call this webinar there. Thanks again for joining. We always are covering all the geopolitical events in real time on the Insights platform. If you don't have access, reach out to sales@kepler.com and we'll get you access. Until then, we'll see you next time, and thanks for joining.